A fortune can vanish in a single generation. We are about to follow the most dramatic falls from grace in history, from trust funds to minimum wage. By the end, you will understand the hidden mechanisms that turned vast inheritance into desperate poverty. How did an heiress worth millions die nearly penniless? And why would a recluse choose a hospital room over her empty mansions? What does it truly cost to be born into a gilded cage? This was a world built not on old land, but on new steel, railroads, and oil. The late 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed a volcanic eruption of wealth, unlike anything America had ever seen. Industrial titans became modern-day royalty, their names synonymous with unimaginable fortune. Think of Cornelius Vanderbilt, who commanded a shipping and railroad empire so vast his fortune was measured in the hundreds of millions, a sum that would be worth hundreds of billions today. Or John Jacob Astor, whose real estate holdings carved the very skyline of New York City. Andrew Carnegie turned steel into a personal kingdom, and his philanthropic motto, "A man who dies rich dies disgraced," would later echo with tragic irony for many of his peers' descendants. These men did not just build companies, they built dynasties. They constructed palatial homes along Fifth Avenue that were called palaces for a reason, with ballrooms that could hold hundreds and private art collections rivaling museums. They established elaborate social seasons governed by a woman named Caroline Astor, whose list of the 400 most important people was literally defined by who could fit into her ballroom. This was the birth of a new American aristocracy, one with no royal blood but all the power, privilege, and most importantly, the expectation of permanence that came with it. Their wealth was so colossal, so seemingly unassailable, that the central question for these families was not how to make money, but how to keep it intact for generations. The answer they devised was the trust fund, a legal fortress designed to protect fortune from fate, from reckless heirs, and from the simple passage of time. It was meant to be an unbreakable chain, linking their Gilded Age to all future ages. But what happens when the chain itself becomes the cage? The trust fund was not a simple bank account. It was an architectural blueprint for dynastic control, a financial fortress with walls made of legal clauses and ironclad stipulations. For the Gilded Age titan, the primary fear was not poverty, but the dissipation of their empire by a weak or spendthrift heir. So they designed a system to outwit human nature itself. The fortune would be placed into a trust, a separate legal entity, overseen not by the heir but by a trustee, often a bank, a lawyer, or a stern family advisor. This trustee held the keys to the vault. The beneficiary, the person born into unimaginable wealth, received not the capital, but a carefully measured allowance, a drip feed of luxury designed to last a lifetime. They could live in the mansion, but they could not sell it. They could spend the income, but they could never touch the principal. It was wealth without ownership, abundance without authority. This created a unique psychological prison. Imagine knowing your name is on deeds to properties worth millions, that your family legacy is celebrated in newspapers and history books. Yet you must petition a committee for the funds to refurbish a single room. Your life is a performance of affluence, funded by a monthly stipend you did not earn and cannot increase. This bred a specific kind of dependency, one draped in silk and self-entitlement. The heir was trained for consumption, not creation. Their role was not to build, but to gracefully inhabit the monument their ancestor had constructed. The trust fund, in its quest to preserve money, often succeeded only in sterilizing ambition. It produced a generation accustomed to everything and in control of nothing, setting the stage for a quiet desperation that would unfold behind the manicured hedges of their estates. Her story is perhaps the most haunting portrait of this gilded cage. Huguette Clark was born in 1906, the daughter of William Andrews Clark, a senator and copper magnate whose wealth was so vast he was called the Copper King. Her childhood was one of almost surreal opulence. The family owned a 121-room mansion on Fifth Avenue in New York, a colossal summer estate in Connecticut named Bellascardo overlooking the ocean, and a sprawling California ranch. She played with dolls dressed by the House of Worth in Paris and owned a Stradivarius violin. This was a life scripted for a fairy tale princess. Yet, by the time Huguette Clark died in 2011 at the age of 104, she had not set foot in any of her palatial homes for over half a century. She spent her final 20 years voluntarily living in simple hospital rooms, despite being in good health. Her vast estates, filled with priceless art, antiques, and memories, sat perfectly preserved and utterly empty, like museums waiting for a visitor who would never come. How does someone choose a sterile hospital over a sun-drenched villa by the sea? The answer lies in the profound isolation her wealth created. Huguette was painfully shy, described as an ethereal figure who preferred the company of her dolls and her art. A brief, failed marriage in her 20s seemed to cement her retreat from the world, but the true fracture came from within the family itself. After her mother's death, a bitter legal battle erupted between Huguette and her half-siblings over their father's will. The trust funds, designed to protect, instead became weapons in a war of attrition. The experience left her deeply distrustful, convinced that those around her only wanted her money. So she withdrew completely. Her hospital room became her castle, a small, controlled space where she could paint, write letters, and watch cartoons, safe from the complexities and betrayals of the outside world. She continued to pay staggering sums to maintain her empty mansions, with staff dusting furniture in rooms no one entered, and gardeners tending to roses no one saw. It was a poignant, heartbreaking paradox. She possessed the means to live anywhere on earth, yet she chose a place associated with sickness and confinement. Her wealth provided everything except the one thing she seemed to crave: a genuine, uncomplicated human connection. The trust fund ensured her fortune remained intact, but it could not protect her from a loneliness so deep that even her billions could not fill it. The tragedy of Huguette Clark's life was only a prelude to the chaos that followed her death. For decades, her fortune had been managed in near total secrecy, a silent engine humming behind the walls of her hospital room. When she finally passed, the revelation of her last wishes ignited a legal firestorm that laid bare the profound isolation her wealth had enforced. Her will, signed in her 90s, left the vast majority of her estate, valued at over $300 million, not to any blood relatives, but to a newly created arts foundation and to her private nurse, her doctor, and her longtime attorney. To her distant relatives, the many half-grandnieces and grandnephews she had never met, she left nothing. They were stunned. They argued that a reclusive centenarian, cut off from the world and dependent on a small circle of caregivers, could not have been of sound mind. They alleged manipulation, suggesting that those entrusted with her care had systematically isolated her and influenced her estate planning for their own benefit. The ensuing court battle was a brutal public autopsy of her final years. Every detail was scrutinized, from the millions in gifts she had given to her nurse over the years to the fact that her attorney had also drafted the will that named him a major beneficiary. It was a classic, painful narrative, the vulnerable heiress and the suspicious advisors. Yet, the deeper truth was more complex and more tragic. Huguette Clark was not a passive victim. She was an active participant in her own seclusion. Her advisors were, for decades, her only consistent human contact. In a life defined by a fear of exploitation following the early family feud, this small circle became her entire world. The trust funds that had shielded her fortune had also shielded her from any need to engage with a wider family network. She had no children, no close friends, and the relatives who now sued were essentially strangers. The legal battle was not a fight over a beloved aunt's legacy. It was a cold corporate takeover attempt by people who shared her DNA, but had never shared a meal with her. In the end, a massive settlement was reached, with distant relatives receiving tens of millions and the foundation being funded. But the damage to her memory was done. Her life story was reduced to tabloid headlines about a crazy old woman and greedy conspirators. The very mechanism designed to protect her wealth and legacy, the intricate system of trusts and advisors, had instead guaranteed that her final chapter would be one of conflict and controversy. Her fortune was preserved, but her humanity was lost in the courtroom. She died as she lived, a spectral figure at the center of a fortune no one could truly touch. Her deepest wish for a quiet, private legacy shattered by the very wealth that made it impossible. If Huguette Clark's story was one of reclusive preservation, the tale of Barbara Hutton is its explosive opposite. She was known by a single, heartbreaking nickname, the poor little rich girl. Born in 1912, Barbara was the granddaughter of Frank Winfield Woolworth, founder of the revolutionary 5 and dime store empire that defined American retail. Her inheritance was staggering, nearly $50 million in today's money, handed to her in a single lump sum on her 21st birthday. It was a sum meant to guarantee a lifetime of fairy tale bliss. Instead, it funded a 7-decade-long public spectacle of profound unhappiness. Barbara Hutton's life became a masterclass in how a trust fund, without the guardrails of purpose or emotional stability, could accelerate a person's ruin rather than prevent it. Her childhood was marked not by love, but by devastating loss. Her mother died by suicide when Barbara was just 4 years old, a tragedy the young girl mistakenly believed she had caused. Her father, a distant figure consumed by his own grief and business, essentially abandoned her to a series of boarding schools and nannies. The foundational message of her life was set in stone. You are alone in the world, and your only true companion is this unimaginable fortune. So she spent her life trying to buy the love and stability she never received as a child. Her 7 marriages read like a tragic roll call of European royalty and Hollywood stars, from a Georgian prince to a Danish count, and the actor Cary Grant. Each union was a media frenzy, a spectacular wedding followed by a painfully public unraveling. She showered her husbands with unimaginable gifts, private jets, castles, and jewels, only to be met with infidelity, humiliation, and outright exploitation. The famous actor Cary Grant was perhaps the one exception, a genuine friend who cared for her. But even that marriage crumbled under the weight of her insecurities and his own ambitions. Beyond the failed marriages was a lifestyle of breathtaking extravagance. She owned palaces across Europe, a penthouse in New York, and a pink marble villa in Tangier. She traveled with an entourage of dozens, including her personal hairdresser and a man whose sole job was to care for her 300 pairs of shoes. A single party could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Yet, those who knew her described a woman who was painfully lonely, often dining alone at a table set for 20, surrounded by servants but devoid of friends. The money did not just flow out through spending, it was actively mismanaged. Her financial advisors made poor investments, and she was the target of constant scams and swindles, too trusting and too desperate for connection to see the predators in her midst. By the end of her life, the $50 million fortune was virtually gone. She sold her legendary jewels to pay bills. When she died in 1979, her estate was valued at just over $3,000. The poor little rich girl had lived a life of glittering emptiness, proving that an inheritance without emotional inheritance is the heaviest burden of all. She searched the world for a home, buying everything she saw, only to die with nothing. Her legendary jewelry collection alone could have funded a small nation. Barbara Hutton owned the famed Pasha diamond, a 40-carat marvel, and the exquisite Marie Antoinette earrings, each piece a portable fortune. She did not just wear jewels, she used them as a social currency, a desperate bid for admiration and belonging. A single strand of her natural pearls was valued at over $400,000 in the 1930s, a sum that could buy multiple mansions. Yet these treasures were often gifts to husbands who would soon leave, or purchases made in a lonely haze, their cold brilliance a poor substitute for human warmth. The palatial homes were another monument to her isolation. She owned Winfield House in London, a grand mansion with its own 12-acre park in the heart of the city, used as the American ambassador's residence today. There was a palace in Cuernavaca, Mexico, and the Villa Fiorentina in the south of France. Each property was staffed by a small army of servants, yet they echoed with a profound silence. Friends recalled visiting her in Tangier, where she would host lavish dinners, only to retire to her bedroom alone to eat a simple meal of crackers and milk, consumed with a haunting sense of melancholy. This private loneliness fueled a very public dependence. To navigate the empty hours and the crushing anxiety that followed her from childhood, Hutton turned to pills and alcohol. Her substance abuse was an open secret in tabloids, which chronicled her slurred public appearances and fragile health. The trust fund, which provided a limitless stream of cash, also financed this self-medication, allowing her to build a prison of addiction within the gilded walls of her home. Her dramatic weight fluctuations and increasingly erratic behavior transformed her public image from a glamorous celebrity heiress to a tragic figure of pity. The world watched in real time as the money that was supposed to protect her instead bankrolled her unraveling. Every failed marriage headline, every blurred photograph from a nightclub, every report of a hospitalization was a chapter in a tragedy funded by her own inheritance. She became a cautionary tale written in diamonds and despair, proving that a fortune without foundation can accelerate a fall as easily as it can elevate a life. While Barbara Hutton sought love across continents a generation earlier, American heiresses were traded for titles in a transaction that treated trust funds as diplomatic currency. The late 19th century saw a remarkable social migration as cash-strapped European aristocrats, their ancestral lands draining their coffers, looked across the Atlantic to the explosive new wealth of America's industrial families. These young women, dubbed the dollar princesses, were the ultimate export, their massive dowries shipped overseas to refurbish crumbling castles and prop up ancient bloodlines. It was a grand bargain, American money for European nobility, but for the heiresses themselves, it was often a life sentence in a gilded, foreign cage. No story captures this stark exchange more perfectly than that of Consuelo Vanderbilt. Born in 1877, she was the daughter of Alva and William Kissam Vanderbilt, heirs to the vast railroad and shipping fortune. From childhood, her formidable mother Alva had one singular ambition for her: to become a duchess. Consuelo was educated not in literature or art for their own sake, but in the rigid etiquette of European courts. Her posture was corrected with a backboard, her social calendar a relentless training ground. She was a product being polished for a very specific market. The target was the 9th Duke of Marlborough, Charles Spencer Churchill, whose family seat was the magnificent but financially crippled Blenheim Palace in England. The Duke needed a massive infusion of cash to restore his estate and maintain his position. The Vanderbilts, swimming in new money but starving for old-world social validation, had exactly what he needed. The marriage was a cold corporate merger. Consuelo, just 18, was in love with an American suitor, but her mother Alva orchestrated a brutal campaign of emotional pressure, feigned illness, and outright threats to force her compliance. On her wedding day in 1895, Consuelo was seen weeping behind her veil as she walked down the aisle of St. Thomas Church in New York. Her dowry was staggering, a sum equivalent to many millions today, which included a huge settlement of Vanderbilt Railroad stock, instantly revitalizing the Marlborough finances and funding extensive renovations at Blenheim. In return, Consuelo received a title, Duchess of Marlborough, and a life of duty in a damp, drafty palace she did not choose. The marriage was miserable from the start. The Duke was distant and demanding, reportedly more interested in the architecture of his palace than in his wife. He insisted she produce an heir, which she did, but their union was one of profound loneliness. Consuelo later wrote of the oppressive formality, the endless, empty rituals, and the deep sense of isolation she felt surrounded by servants and tradition, but devoid of companionship or love. She had traded the control of a Vanderbilt trust fund for the rigid protocols of an aristocratic title, exchanging one form of gilded confinement for another. Her wealth rebuilt Blenheim stone walls, but it could not build a home within them. The transaction was complete, the fortune secured for the Marlborough line, but the human cost was immense. a poignant reminder that when money and bloodline are the primary currencies, the heart is always the first thing bankrupted. For the families built on steel and railroads, the world outside their ballrooms seemed a distant concern. Their trust funds were fortresses, designed to withstand the whims of a single generation. But in the autumn of 1929, an earthquake struck that would shake the very foundations of their gilded world. The Wall Street crash was not just a market correction, it was a systemic collapse. Fortunes that had been carefully curated over decades evaporated in a matter of days, not on paper, but in reality. Many of the great dynasties were heavily invested in the very stocks that were now worthless. Trust funds, which often held large portfolios of equities, saw their values gutted. The steady, reliable income from those investments, the lifeblood of the allowance, simply stopped flowing. Mansions still stood, but the money to heat them, staff them, and maintain their vast grounds was suddenly, terrifyingly scarce. The Great Depression that followed turned a financial crisis into a social revolution. The public's view of immense, concentrated wealth soured dramatically. The spectacle of an heiress buying another diamond necklace while bread lines stretched for city blocks became a potent symbol of a broken system. This cultural shift paved the way for the most direct assault on dynastic wealth, the modern tax code. In the years that followed, the government introduced steeply progressive income taxes and, most critically, hefty estate and inheritance taxes. These were the legal wrecking balls to the Gilded Age blueprint. The old strategy of passing an entire fortune, intact, to the next generation became mathematically impossible. A fortune of $100 million could lose a third or more to the taxman upon the patriarch's death, forcing the liquidation of family businesses, the selling of art collections, and the dismantling of the very estates the trust was meant to preserve. Then came the World Wars. These global conflicts demanded immense national sacrifice and further reshaped the economy. Family wealth tied to outdated industries, like certain manufacturing or railroads, began to stagnate as new technologies emerged. The wars also imposed heavy taxes to fund the military effort, another drain on static fortunes. For the heirs, this perfect storm of external pressures created an impossible squeeze. They were raised with imperial expectations, a belief that their wealth was as permanent as the granite of their Fifth Avenue shadows. Yet they now faced a world where the allowance could not cover the astronomical costs of upkeep, where the tax bill could force the sale of the family seat, and where public sentiment viewed them as relics of a bygone, unfair era. The fortress walls, so meticulously designed to keep the world out, were now crumbling from the outside in. The trust fund, built for permanence, met a force it could never have anticipated, the relentless tide of history itself. This profound lack of financial literacy created a perfect hunting ground. For every heir like Huguette Clark, who retreated into solitude, there were dozens more who remained in the world, smiling for the cameras while their fortunes were quietly dismantled from within. Sheltered from the realities of business and raised to see money as an endless birthright, they possessed immense wealth but zero financial immune system. This made them irresistible targets for a specific kind of predator, the trusted advisor. The very lawyers, accountants, and investment managers hired to protect the family fortune often became the instruments of its ruin. Doris Duke, the so-called richest girl in the world, inherited a tobacco and hydroelectric fortune worth many hundreds of millions. She was a sharp, independent woman with a passion for philanthropy and preservation. Yet in her later years, she fell under the sway of a butler named Bernard Lafferty. After her death, it was revealed he had exerted enormous influence over her, was named an executor of her will, and stood to gain millions. The resulting legal battles alleged manipulation on a grand scale, suggesting her final wishes had been clouded by his presence. While the full truth remains complex, the case highlighted a terrifying vulnerability. The person pouring your tea could be plotting to inherit your estate. For others, the danger was not in a single servant, but in a systemic failure of stewardship. Heirs would receive monthly statements they did not understand, showing steady but mediocre returns, while their trustees collected hefty management fees regardless of performance. There was no incentive for growth, only for preservation and the continued collection of commissions. This passive mismanagement allowed inflation to silently eat away at purchasing power for decades, a slow leak that left heirs feeling progressively poorer without understanding why. Then there were the outright frauds. The heir, eager to prove they had business acumen or to chase a glamorous new venture, would be presented with a can't-miss opportunity. A charming promoter would arrive with blueprints for a revolutionary invention or plans for a luxury resort. Flattered and bored, the heir would sign over huge sums, only to watch the promoter disappear and the venture collapse. These were not sophisticated Ponzi schemes, but simple confidence tricks that worked precisely because the target had never been told no, and had never learned the hard lesson that if something sounds too good to be true, it almost always is. Perhaps the most chilling drain was the legal one. Family attorneys, entrenched for generations, would charge exorbitant fees for routine services. Every phone call, every letter, every minor amendment to a trust document would be billed at a staggering rate. Complex, unnecessary legal structures would be created, generating more billable hours. The heir, taught to defer to experts, would simply sign the invoices, unaware they were paying 10 times the market rate for a service they did not need. In this shadow economy of exploitation, the trust fund did not protect the heir. It painted a target on their back. It announced to the world that here was a person with vast resources and no practical knowledge of how to defend them. The fortune became a public resource, siphoned off by bad advice, drained by neglect, and plundered by deceit, leaving the heir bewildered and bankrupt in a mansion they could no longer afford to heat. The pressure to perform this inherited role was a financial death by 1,000 cuts. It was never one reckless purchase that broke the fortune, but the relentless, grinding cost of keeping up appearances. For an heir, their lifestyle was not a choice, it was a mandate. The family name, the historic homes, the social standing, all of it demanded a continuous theater of affluence. You could not simply decide to downsize. Selling the Newport cottage or closing off wings of the mansion would be read not as prudence, but as failure, a public admission that the dynasty was in decline. So the show had to go on at any cost. The trust fund provided a generous allowance, but it was designed for a stable world of servants' wages and cheap coal. It could not possibly cover the reality of the 20th century, with its soaring taxes, inflation, and the astronomical upkeep of aging palaces. Consider the simple math of a Gilded Age mansion. A home with 60 rooms might require a staff of 20 or 30, from butlers and cooks to gardeners and chauffeurs. Each required a salary, room, and board. The property taxes alone on such a landmark could be a small fortune. Then there was the maintenance, the leaking roof that required custom slate, the antique plumbing that needed specialist artisans, the acres of formal gardens that demanded a small army of landscapers. The trust income might cover the staff's salaries, but the $500,000 roof repair would demand dipping into the capital, the sacred principle that was never to be touched. And that was just one house. Many families owned several: a city mansion, a country estate, a summer cottage, all standing like hungry monuments, constantly consuming money. The social calendar was another bottomless pit. The heir was expected to host seasons of entertainment, from formal dinners for 50 to weekend house parties for 20. The wine cellar had to be stocked with the finest vintages, the table set with inherited silver, the guests entertained by musicians or even private theatricals. Charity galas required not just attendance, but leadership and massive donations to maintain the family's philanthropic reputation. A single ball could cost more than a middle-class family earned in a year. And what of personal presentation? The heir's wardrobe, the wife's jewels from Cartier, the children's education at exclusive boarding schools and Ivy League colleges. All were non-negotiable line items in the budget of legacy. This created a perilous cycle. As the capital was slowly drained to patch the roof and fund the gala, the investment principal shrank. A smaller principal generated less investment income the following year. Yet the costs, fixed by social expectation, did not shrink. They often grew. So the next year, an even larger chunk of capital had to be invaded to fill the gap. It was like trying to heat a cavernous ballroom by burning the floorboards, one plank at a time. You stay warm for a little while, but you are literally destroying the foundation you stand on. The heir, trapped in this cycle, often felt both rich and desperate. They lived surrounded by priceless art and antiques, yet they might lie awake at night worrying about the payroll for the staff. They could write a check for a new Rolls Royce, but could not afford to repair the carriage house it sat in. This was the cruel irony of the lifestyle trap. The performance of wealth, demanded by the very legacy they were trying to uphold, became the primary engine of its destruction. They were not buying yachts and throwing money away. They were spending a fortune just to stand still, to preserve a world that was economically obsolete. In the end, many were forced to sell the very treasures they were bleeding to protect. A final, humiliating act that revealed the performance was over. The stage itself had to be sold off, piece by piece, to pay for the last season's curtains. But the most devastating siege often came from within the family itself. When the patriarch or matriarch finally passed, the legal fortress of the trust fund did not guarantee peace. It frequently ignited a war. The reading of the will became not a moment of unity, but the first salvo in a bitter, multi-year battle that could drain an estate faster than any spendthrift heir. These inheritance wars reveal a brutal truth. Without a clear purpose or a foundation of genuine relationship, vast wealth becomes a poison that turns blood relatives into sworn enemies. The case of tobacco heiress Doris Duke is a textbook example of how a fortune can be consumed by suspicion and litigation. Duke was an intensely private woman, the only child of a billionaire, who grew into a savvy businesswoman and a dedicated philanthropist. Yet her final years, like Huguette Clark's, were spent in seclusion, under the care of a close circle that included her butler, Bernard Lafferty. When she died in 1993, her will named Lafferty as an executor and left him a $5 million bequest, along with a lifetime annual salary as the caretaker of her foundation. To her distant relatives and even to some former employees cut out of the will, this was a red flag. They launched a massive legal challenge, alleging that Lafferty and Duke's doctor had deliberately over-medicated the elderly heiress, isolating her and exerting undue influence to manipulate her estate plan. The ensuing court battle was a media circus, a brutal public dissection of Doris Duke's mental state, her medications, and her relationships. For years, the legal fees mounted, paid from the very estate they were fighting over. Forensic accountants, handwriting experts, and a parade of witnesses were hired at staggering cost. In the end, a settlement was reached, Lafferty's inheritance was reduced, and the foundations received their funds. But the damage was irreversible. Millions that could have gone to charity, to art preservation, or to environmental causes, the passions of Doris Duke's life, were instead funneled into the pockets of lawyers. The family name was dragged through tabloid mud, and her legacy was forever shadowed by scandal and strife. This pattern repeated itself in dynasty after dynasty. A will would be discovered, perhaps signed in the final, frail days of a reclusive parent. It would favor a new spouse, a caregiver, or one child over the others. The disinherited siblings would cry foul, alleging coercion or diminished capacity. They would hire their own battery of attorneys, and the fortune would become a battlefield. The legal fees in these cases are not minor. We are talking about teams of high-powered lawyers billing hundreds of dollars per hour for years on end. Expert witnesses cost hundreds of thousands. Court costs and administrative fees pile up. It is not uncommon for an estate worth $50 million to see 10 or 15 million evaporate before a single beneficiary sees a penny. The emotional cost is even higher. These lawsuits fracture families permanently. Cousins who grew up together stop speaking. Siblings become lifelong adversaries. Thanksgiving gatherings are replaced with depositions. The shared history of a family is rewritten as a narrative of betrayal and greed. In the end, even the victors often lose. They may win a larger share of the diminished pie, but they have lost their family, their privacy, and any sense of peace surrounding their inheritance. The trust fund, designed to bind a family together across generations, instead becomes the weapon that tears it apart. The money outlives the love, and the final inheritance is a lesson in distrust. The quiet desperation of a gilded cage could still seem a world away from outright criminality. Yet for one famous heiress, the path from trust fund to infamy would not be paved by slow decline, but by a single, violent rupture. In February of 1974, 19-year-old Patty Hearst was living a life scripted by her lineage. She was the granddaughter of the legendary newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst, heiress to a media empire and a fortune so vast it built a castle. She was a sophomore at the University of California, Berkeley. sharing a modest apartment with her fiancé, a deliberate step away from overt luxury. Then, one ordinary evening, her world was shattered. 3 armed members of a radical leftist group called the Symbionese Liberation Army burst into her home, beat her fiancé, and dragged her, screaming and struggling, into the trunk of a car. The kidnapping of Patty Hearst was not just a crime, it was a national spectacle. The SLA saw her not as a person, but as a symbol, the ultimate prisoner of the capitalist class. They demanded a massive food distribution program for the poor, funded by the Hearst family as a ransom. Her father, Randolph Hearst, complied, organizing a multi-million-dollar food giveaway that descended into chaos. But the SLA had a more sinister goal than ransom. They subjected Patty to weeks of brutal psychological torture. She was kept blindfolded in a closet, physically and sexually assaulted, and brainwashed with relentless political diatribes. The isolation and terror were designed to break her identity and rebuild her as one of them. Then, the unthinkable happened. 2 months after her abduction, surveillance cameras captured a grainy image from a bank in San Francisco. A young woman wearing a beret and holding a carbine rifle was seen participating in the armed robbery. The FBI identified her. It was Patty Hearst. She had taken the name Tanya and issued a taped statement, declaring she had joined the SLA and embraced their revolution. The public was horrified and fascinated. Was this a terrified victim acting under duress? Or had the heiress truly renounced her gilded world for a life of violent rebellion? The legal system would soon deliver its answer, with consequences that would ripple through the Hearst fortune and redefine the family's legacy for decades. The trial of Patty Hearst became a national obsession, dissecting not just a crime, but the very nature of identity under pressure. Her defense team argued she was a brainwashed victim, a psychological prisoner coerced into every action. The prosecution painted her as a willing convert, pointing to the bank robbery footage and her defiant statements as evidence of a conscious choice. The jury believed the latter. In March of 1976, she was convicted of bank robbery and sentenced to 35 years in prison. The heiress to one of America's greatest fortunes was now a federal inmate. Yet her story was far from over. After serving just under 2 years, her sentence was commuted by President Jimmy Carter, and she received a full pardon from President Bill Clinton in 2001. The legal forgiveness was official, but the social and personal reconstruction would be a lifelong project. Patty Hearst did not return to the gilded orbit of her family's legacy. Instead, she chose a path of deliberate quiet, building a life defined not by inheritance, but by the ordinary things she had once been denied. She married her former bodyguard, Bernard Shaw, and they settled into a quiet domesticity in Connecticut, far from the media glare of California. She raised 2 daughters, deliberately shielding them from the public eye, giving them the stable, private childhood she had lost. Her career became another act of reclamation. She turned not to philanthropy or high society, but to work. She became an actress, landing supporting roles in films by director John Waters, who saw in her a unique, wry resilience. She authored a memoir and later, with her daughter, wrote a series of cozy mystery novels. These were not the pursuits of a celebrity heiress seeking attention. They were the choices of a woman building a self, brick by brick, on her own terms. Her public appearances were rare and carefully controlled, often related to her work. The transformation was profound. The woman once known as Tenia, gripping a rifle in a bank, became a grandmother who enjoyed gardening and antiquing. She managed her share of the hearse trust, but it no longer defined her. The fortune provided security, but it did not dictate her identity. In many ways, Patty Hearst's journey represents the most extreme version of escaping the gilded cage. Her cage was not one of loneliness or decadence, but of violent ideology and trauma. Her path back was not through reclaiming aristocratic status, but through embracing the mundane comforts of family, creative work, and chosen anonymity. She demonstrated that after the trust fund's promise of a scripted life is violently torn up, a person can still author a new ending, one written in the quiet ink of ordinary days. The final public unraveling of a dynasty was not a quiet affair. It was a spectacle, a humiliating parade of loss, where the most intimate symbols of a family's legacy were laid bare for strangers to appraise and purchase. After decades of quiet internal decay, the hidden crisis would finally breach the mansion walls in the form of bankruptcy filings and forced liquidations. This was not merely a financial transaction. It was a ritual dismantling, piece by painful piece, of a world that had once seemed eternal. The great equalizer was the auctioneer's gavel. To satisfy creditors, back taxes, or staggering legal fees, courts would order the sale of assets, and so the contents of palaces would be cataloged, tagged, and open to the public. Imagine a grand gallery where old master paintings, once curated for private enjoyment, now have lot numbers stuck to their frames. Georgian silver tea services, engraved with a family crest, are weighed for their melt value. A library of first editions, collected over generations, is sorted into boxes by the foot. These were not just objects, they were the physical memory of a lineage, now stripped of context and meaning, reduced to mere merchandise. The estate sale became a macabre tourist attraction. Curious onlookers and bargain hunters would stream through rooms once reserved for ambassadors and dukes, peering into closets, testing the springs of antique divans, and haggling over the price of a monogrammed napkin ring. For the heirs, if they dared to attend, it was a special kind of torment. They would witness a stranger casually bidding on their mother's favorite writing desk, or see the portrait of a stern ancestor carried out the door by a dealer who planned to resell it at a markup. Each item sold was a piece of their history leaving forever, a tangible confirmation that the fortress had fallen. The ultimate symbol of dissolution was the sale of the house itself. The country estate that hosted legendary parties, the Fifth Avenue mansion that defined an era, would be listed with a realtor. Newspaper articles would chronicle the sale, often with a tone of morbid fascination or quiet schadenfreude. Photographs of empty, echoing ballrooms and overgrown formal gardens served as an epitaph. The property might be bought by a university, a religious order, or a new money entrepreneur who would gut it and rebuild. The very stones seemed to weep the history they had witnessed. This public liquidation was more than an economic necessity. It was a profound cultural reckoning. It visually demonstrated that the Gilded Age's central project, the creation of permanent, self-sustaining dynasties, had ultimately failed. The auction block did not care about bloodlines or titles. It only recognized the cold calculus of debt and value. In that crowded room, amid the chatter of bids, the accumulated weight of a century's ambition, pride, and careful curation was scattered to the winds, leaving behind only empty walls and the ghost of a fortune that could not, in the end, buy permanence. The auctioneer's gavel left behind a silence far deeper than the loss of any painting. For the heirs who had watched their world be sold off, the final, most brutal chapter was just beginning. They now faced a reality their ancestors had engineered them never to encounter: life on, or perilously close to, minimum wage. This was not merely a reduction in comfort. It was an existential earthquake. The financial freefall was, of course, immediate and terrifying. The trust income was gone, the capital dissipated. They might retain a small, rapidly dwindling sum, but their burn rate, the cost of simply existing as they knew how, was catastrophic. The first brutal lesson was housing. The mansion was gone. They had to find an apartment, a concept utterly foreign. Negotiating a lease, paying a security deposit, understanding utility bills, these were mundane tasks their staff had always handled. They often had no credit history, as they had never taken out a loan or held a credit card in their own name. Landlords viewed them with suspicion. The sheer physical scale of their lives shrank from acres to a few hundred square feet. The social death was even more isolating. Their entire identity was woven into a web of exclusive clubs, charity boards, and seasonal migrations. That world operated on a single, unspoken currency: financial contribution. When the money vanished, the invitation stopped. The phone that once rang constantly with party planners and social secretaries fell silent. Friends, who were really acquaintances bound by mutual status, simply faded away. They became ghosts in a city they once ruled, walking past their old clubs where they were no longer members, seeing their former peers in society pages living a life that was now a museum exhibit to them. The loneliness was profound, a cocktail of shame, confusion, and grief for a country that had exiled them. Then came the necessity of work. They had been educated, often at the finest schools, but not for a profession. Their curriculum was classical languages, art history, and equestrian skills, designed for connoisseurship, not careerism. They possessed no marketable degree, no resume, and no concept of a 9-to-5 job. Applying for a position was a humiliating ordeal. How do you list managing a household staff of 20 or curating a private art collection on an application for a clerical job? Their famous name, once a key to every door, was now a liability, inviting either awkward curiosity or immediate dismissal from employers who assumed they were slumming or utterly incapable. For the first time in their lives, they faced rejection, and they faced it from people they had been raised to believe were their social inferiors. The psychological whiplash was devastating. The unshakable confidence bred by a lifetime of automatic deference crumbled in the face of a skeptical store manager or an impatient office supervisor. Everyday interactions became a minefield of unfamiliar rituals. Grocery shopping, cooking a meal, doing laundry, taking public transportation. These were alien, exhausting puzzles. They had never pumped gas, never balanced a checkbook, never compared prices. The noise and anonymity of a crowded subway car were a sensory assault, after a lifetime of private cars and quiet halls. The world was not just smaller, it was louder, faster, and utterly indifferent to their presence. They had lost the invisible shield that great wealth provides, the bubble that smooths every friction. Now they felt every bump, every delay, every slight. The gilded cage had at least been gilded, a prison of luxury. This new life felt like being pushed, naked and unprepared, into a bustling marketplace where no one knew their name and no one cared. Their inheritance had not equipped them for survival, only for stewardship of a kingdom that no longer existed. They were aristocrats shipwrecked on the island of the ordinary, trying to build a shelter with tools they had never been taught to use. The Astor name was a cornerstone of American aristocracy, a dynasty built on fur, real estate, and social supremacy that spanned 2 centuries. It stood for philanthropy, for boxes at the opera, and for a certain unassailable dignity. Yet even this most legendary of fortunes was not immune to the final, most degrading stage of a dynasty's fall. A criminal trial that played out not in tabloids, but in a criminal courtroom. The story centers not on a reclusive heiress, but on her only son. Brooke Astor, the beloved doyenne of New York society, was celebrated for her grace, her sharp wit, and her immense philanthropic generosity, giving away nearly $200 million to libraries, museums, and the city's needy during her lifetime. Her later years, however, were clouded by advanced age and dementia. Her son, Anthony Marshall, a decorated former diplomat and Broadway producer, was entrusted with her care and the management of her affairs. What unfolded next would become a sensational legal drama that exposed a chilling narrative of exploitation within a gilded penthouse. Prosecutors alleged that as his mother's mental faculties dimmed, Anthony Marshall, then in his 80s himself, systematically plundered her estate. The charges were stark, that he had coerced her into changing her will to benefit him and his wife, Charlene, at the expense of her beloved charities. That he had awarded himself massive raises for managing her finances, millions of dollars in unauthorized gifts. That he had sold a prized Childa Hassam painting from her collection and pocketed the proceeds. The most heartbreaking allegation was that he had deliberately allowed his mother, a woman for whom elegance was a religion, to live in squalor, cutting her care staff and denying her basic comforts to preserve more money for himself. The trial in 2009 was a grim spectacle. The prosecution painted Marshall as a greedy son, waiting for his inheritance while his mother languished. The defense argued he was a devoted child making difficult financial decisions for a woman who, in her lucid moments, wanted to provide for him. The courtroom heard from household staff who described finding the socialite in a tattered nightgown, sleeping on a urine-stained couch, her dog's feces ground into the carpet. Friends testified that in her final years, she did not recognize them, and at times did not even recognize her own son. After a 6-month trial, the jury delivered a guilty verdict. Anthony Marshall, the son of Brooke Astor, was convicted of grand larceny and other charges, a felon at the age of 85. The sentence was 1 to 3 years in prison, though he served only 2 months due to his failing health. The impact was catastrophic for the Astor legacy. The family name, synonymous with civic duty and noblesse oblige, was now forever linked with elder abuse and theft. The fortune, which had already been diminished by generations in philanthropy, was further drained by legal fees and settlements. More than the money, it was the moral capital that was obliterated. Here was not a story of an heir squandering wealth on fast living, but of one allegedly manipulating a vulnerable parent from within the innermost circle of trust. It revealed that the final threat to a dynasty might not be the outside world, a stock market crash, or a spendthrift heir, but a cold, calculated betrayal from the person supposed to be its guardian. The Gilded Cage, in its last act, had become a crime scene. This public unraveling was never a private affair. From the very beginning, the press served as both the architect and the wrecking ball for these dynastic reputations. In the Gilded Age, society pages in newspapers like the New York Tribune functioned as a sacred ledger. A mention of your ball, a description of your gown, a listing of your prominent guests. This was the oxygen of social legitimacy. The press built these families into modern royalty, narrating their opulent lives with a breathless reverence that instructed the public on who mattered. But that same machinery held a latent power, the power to ignore. To be left off the guest list in print was a social death sentence. This created a symbiotic, toxic relationship where the wealthy needed the press to validate their status, and the press needed the spectacle of their lives to sell papers. The shift from reverence to revelry was almost inevitable. As the 20th century progressed and the mystique of old money began to tarnish, the tone changed. The downfall of an heiress was no longer a tragedy. It was a front-page sport. Barbara Hutton's every misstep was chronicled with a mix of faux concern and thinly veiled glee. Headlines screamed about her weight, her divorces, her drunken stumbles. The narrative of the poor little rich girl was a media invention that sold millions, reducing a complex human tragedy to a catchy, pitiable label. The public consumed these stories with a potent mixture of fascination and schadenfreude, that German term meaning pleasure derived from another's misfortune. Why? Because these falls served a deep psychological need. They were a great societal corrective, a proof that the universe still had a sense of justice. If immense wealth could not buy happiness, if it could actually manufacture misery, then the average person's struggles felt more honorable, their simpler joys more authentic. The heiress weeping into her champagne at an empty table was a comforting image to someone worrying about the rent. It reinforced the idea that money was not the answer, a narrative that made inequality slightly more palatable. The modern tabloid and digital media ecosystem perfected this dance. The Patty Hearst saga was a 24-hour news cycle before the term existed, with every twist analyzed and sensationalized. The courtroom dramas of Doris Duke or Brooke Astor became real-life soap operas, with reporters dissecting every legal filing and every tearful testimony. The camera's hungry gaze on the auction of a family's treasures was not just reporting. It was a ritual humiliation broadcast for mass consumption. The press no longer merely reported the fall, it actively accelerated it, turning private agony into public spectacle to feed an insatiable appetite. This frenzy created a cruel paradox. These individuals, who had been raised to believe in their own inherent importance, found their most vulnerable moments, their addictions, their legal battles, their cognitive decline, transformed into cheap entertainment. Their value as human beings was completely eclipsed by their value as a cautionary tale. In the end, the same society pages that once anointed them as royalty were now writing their obituaries with a headline that forever defined them by their ruin. The Gilded Cage, it turned out, had glass walls, and the whole world was watching and cheering as it finally shattered. The same gilded patterns are not locked in history books. They are being written today in the lives of modern heirs and celebrity offspring. The names have changed, but the psychological architecture of the trust fund remains eerily similar. A system that can create dependency as easily as it provides security. Consider the very public struggles of figures like Paris Hilton or Nicole Richie in the early 2000s. They were not old money heiresses, but they were beneficiaries of immense wealth and fame, living under the glare of a new kind of press, the 24-hour celebrity news cycle. Their rebellions, documented in reality television and tabloids, echoed the self-destructive escapades of past generations, a cry for identity from within a gilded bubble. Today, we see the children of tech billionaires and entertainment moguls navigating this same fraught landscape. They are handed a life script of expectation to be the worthy custodians of a brand or a fortune they did not build. The pressure to not screw it up is immense, and the lifestyle trap is just as real. Maintaining the public image of a successful heir requires a constant performance, one funded by an allowance that may feel limitless, but is often tightly controlled by trustees or family offices. The risk of mismanagement is not a relic either. A modern heir, perhaps a social media influencer with millions of followers, might be a brand unto themselves, but that does not mean they understand compound interest, tax law, or the dangers of predatory investment schemes. They can be just as vulnerable to bad financial advice, to friends with can't-miss business ventures, or to the simple, slow drain of an extravagant lifestyle that outpaces even a substantial trust's returns. We have seen young celebrities blow through multi-million-dollar fortunes from record deals or inheritances in a handful of years, left with nothing but a closet of designer clothes and a mountain of debt. The journey from trust fund to financial anxiety is not a historical curiosity. It is a recurring human story because the core dilemma remains unchanged. What is the purpose of wealth without the struggle to attain it? How do you build a meaningful life when your path appears pre-paved? The modern twist is the added layer of perpetual public scrutiny, where every purchase, every failure, every attempt at a career is dissected online, amplifying both the pressure to perform and the humiliation of any stumble. The digital age has simply put glass walls on a very old cage, letting the whole world watch the same timeless drama of privilege and identity play out in real time. Losing a fortune is not just a financial crisis. It is an annihilation of the self. For the heir, their wealth was never just money in a bank. It was the very architecture of their identity. Their name, their social standing, their daily purpose, their sense of belonging, all were built upon that foundational fortune. When it crumbles, it does not leave behind a blank slate. It leaves a psychological crater. The most immediate wound is to their sense of self-worth. In a world that had always measured their value by their last name and their bank balance, what are they worth now? The deference of shopkeepers, the invitations from charities, the respect of peers, all evaporate. they are forced to confront a terrifying question. If I am not a Vanderbilt, an Astor, a Hearst, then who am I? Without the performance of affluence to define them, they feel invisible, a ghost in their own life. This crisis of purpose is equally devastating. Their entire existence was curated around the stewardship of legacy, a full-time job of maintaining homes, attending functions, and upholding a family narrative. Suddenly, that job is eliminated. There is no estate to manage, no social calendar to uphold, no dynasty to represent. The days stretch out, empty and meaningless. Or a factory worker might find purpose in a craft, or a teacher in nurturing minds. The heir finds only a void where their life's work used to be. This profound loss often manifests in a deep clinical depression, a grief not for the money, but for an entire world and a self that has died. The statistics are stark. Studies of sudden financial loss, even on a smaller scale, show dramatic spikes in anxiety, depressive disorders, and substance abuse. For the heir, the available coping mechanisms are tragically familiar. The trust fund that once financed their gilded life can also finance their escape from the pain of losing it. Alcohol and prescription pills, always readily available in their social circles, become tools to numb the shame and the emptiness. An addiction that might have been a whispered secret during the years of plenty can spiral into a public downfall once the money is gone, because now they cannot afford the discreet private clinics that once treated them. The tragedy is compounded by a lifetime of emotional insulation. Many heirs were raised by nanas and sent to boarding schools, taught to value stoicism and manners over genuine emotional expression. They never developed the emotional vocabulary or the resilient coping skills to handle a catastrophe of this magnitude. They were taught how to host a dinner for 50, but not how to process profound grief. They were trained to manage a staff, but not to manage despair. So they retreat, just as Huguette Clark did, but without the billions to build a hospital room fortress. They become recluses in small apartments, paralyzed by the fear of being recognized and pitied, or worse, not recognized at all. The world outside feels hostile and alien, a place where they no longer know the rules. Forming a new identity separate from wealth is a monumental task. It requires learning for the first time who you are when no one is curtsying. It means finding value in your own character, your own humor, your own capacity for work or kindness, traits that were never the currency of your old world. Some never make that journey, forever haunted by the ghost of what they lost, living in a permanent state of nostalgic melancholy. Others, like Patty Hearst in her later years, slowly and painfully assemble a new self from the fragments, choosing a quiet life of chosen connections and personal work. But the scar remains, a permanent fissure between the person they were raised to be and the person they had to become. The inheritance did not just give them everything, it took from them the one thing we all must build for ourselves, a self that can survive when everything else is gone. But not every heiress succumbed to the undertow of their fortune. For a select few, that immense wealth became not a prison, but a platform, and the key to this radical shift was a single, powerful force, purpose. While one path led to personal ruin, another could forge a legacy that outlasted money itself. The most striking example of this divergence is found within the very same family that produced the captive Duchess of Marlborough. Her mother, Alva Vanderbilt, was the architect of that dynastic marriage, a woman of iron will who understood that wealth was a tool for social conquest. After orchestrating her daughter's wedding and then her own divorce, a scandalous act at the time, Alva did not retreat. She remarried, becoming Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, and underwent a profound transformation. She channeled her formidable energy, her vast resources, and her understanding of power away from ballroom politics and toward a far greater fight, the battle for women's right to vote. She used her fortune as a war chest. She founded the Political Equality League, bankrolled rallies and parades, paid for leaflets and speakers, and even bailed suffragists out of jail. Her Newport mansion, Marble House, once a monument to Gilded Age excess, became the site of strategic planning meetings for the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Here was the same wealth that insulated others from reality, being deployed to change reality for millions. Alva did not just write checks. She built organizations, leveraged her social connections for the cause, and brought a ruthless managerial efficiency to the movement. Her wealth gave her a megaphone and the security to shout into it without fear of financial repercussion. She found a mission that was larger than her family name, and in doing so, she insulated herself from the spiritual emptiness that consumed so many of her peers. The money was a means, not an end. This sense of purpose provided a psychological armor. Her identity was not heiress, but suffragist. Her value was not tied to her bank balance, but to her contribution to a historic victory. When the 19th Amendment was finally ratified in 1920, Alva Belmont, then in her late 60s, could look at her life and see not a collection of drained bank accounts and empty mansions, but a nation she had helped reshape. Her fortune was undoubtedly spent in this pursuit, but it was spent with intention, on a cause that gave her life meaning far beyond material comfort. She was not preserving a dying world, she was helping birth a new one. Contrast this with the trajectory of someone like Barbara Hutton. Both women possessed staggering wealth, but one directed it outward toward a collective struggle, while the other directed it inward toward a futile search for personal fulfillment. Barbara's spending was an attempt to fill an internal void, to purchase the love and stability she never had. Every diamond, every palace, every doomed marriage was a transaction aimed at healing a childhood wound. The money disappeared into a bottomless pit of personal need. Alva's spending, however, was an investment in an external ideal. The money flowed out, but it built something: momentum, political change, institutions. This fundamental orientation outward versus inward often dictated whether an heir would be consumed by their fortune or would command it. Purpose provided a compass. It answered the paralyzing question of, what am I to do with my life? It created a framework for decision-making that went beyond mere consumption. It connected the heir to the wider world, giving them a stake in society's progress rather than a retreat from its problems. This is not to say philanthropic heiresses were immune to financial mismanagement or personal sorrow, but the presence of a driving mission often acted as a bulwark against total collapse. It replaced the endless, anxious performance of leisure with the gratifying work of achievement. Their names were remembered not for their scandals or their bankruptcies, but for the hospitals, the libraries, the schools, and the social movements they forged. Their wealth did not define them, It was merely the fuel for a life that did. A woman's fortune was rarely her own. In the rigidly patriarchal society of the Gilded Age and its aftermath, being a female heiress was a paradox of immense power and profound powerlessness. She was the carrier of the dynasty's wealth, yet she was almost never its controller. This fundamental disconnect between ownership and agency made her uniquely vulnerable, turning what should have been security into a trap with multiple locks, and her subsequent fall not just a personal tragedy, but a heavily moralized public spectacle. The legal structures of the time were explicitly designed to transfer control from woman to man. Upon marriage, a doctrine called coverture often meant a wife's legal identity was subsumed under her husband's. Any property she brought into the marriage, including her inheritance, could legally become his to manage and, in many cases, to spend. Her signature on financial documents was often meaningless without his co-signature. This meant that even if a trust fund was established in her name, the authority to make decisions about investments, property sales, or major expenditures frequently rested with a male trustee, a bank officer, a family lawyer, or her own husband. She lived in a palace, but she did not hold the keys to the treasury. She was the jewel in the crown, but the crown was worn by someone else. This lack of financial literacy was not an accident. It was an expectation. A wealthy young woman's education focused on the arts of social management, not asset management. She learned to plan a menu for 50, not to read a balance sheet. She was taught to recognize a fine painting, not to negotiate its sale. This deliberate gap in her knowledge made her entirely dependent on the men around her for financial survival, leaving her dangerously exposed to both well-intentioned paternalism and outright exploitation. When her husband or trustee was prudent and honest, she might live comfortably, yet still without true autonomy. When he was reckless, greedy, or simply incompetent, she was a passenger on a sinking ship, watching the disaster unfold but powerless to grab the wheel. The spectacular collapse of a female heiress was therefore loaded with a specific, cruel symbolism. Society watched with a mix of horror and secret satisfaction. Her fall was seen as a failure not just of finance, but of femininity. Had she been more discerning in her choice of husband, had she been too extravagant, too emotional, too weak to manage the fortune entrusted to her name? The press and the public dissected her spending on clothes and parties, with a scrutiny never applied to a profligate male heir. Barbara Hutton's saga was so captivating precisely because it fit this ancient narrative. The woman who cannot handle wealth, who squanders it on romance and finery. Her search for love was pathologized as a character flaw, rather than understood as a desperate consequence of the emotional vacuum her wealth and gender role had created. Meanwhile, the men who actually managed, mismanaged, or stole her money, the trustees, the advisors, the husbands often faded into the background of the story. The drama was about her visible consumption, not their invisible control. This dynamic made the rare female heiress who seized agency, like Alva Belmont, so revolutionary. She fought not only for suffrage, but for the right to control the fortune she brought into her marriages. She used the law and her own formidable will to break the legal locks on her gilded cage. For every Alva, however, there were countless others who lived and died within the confines of their trust funds, their lives a testament to a simple, brutal truth. It is one thing to inherit a kingdom, and another entirely to be allowed to rule it. Yet for every dynasty that vanished into memory, a handful of heirs did the unthinkable. They built a new life from the rubble. These are not stories of reclaiming lost fortunes, but of discovering a different kind of wealth, one measured in self-reliance and purpose. Their journeys prove that hitting bottom, when that bottom is far from the gilded pedestal, can sometimes provide the only solid ground on which to stand. One of the most remarkable turnarounds belongs to a man named William Vanderbilt, the great-great-grandson of the Commodore. By the 1970s, the direct Vanderbilt fortune had been scattered to the winds through generations of spending and division. William, while not destitute, was a far cry from his industrialist ancestors. He worked as a teacher and a farmer, living a quiet, modest life in Maine. But his passion was not for finance. It was for history and preservation. He dedicated decades of his life to meticulously restoring the breakers, the Newport summer cottage built by his great-grandfather. He did not do this as a wealthy patron writing checks, but as a hands-on historian giving tours, leading restoration efforts, and serving as the president of the Preservation Society. In a profound twist, the man who inherited only a fragment of the Vanderbilt wealth became the most dedicated steward of its most iconic physical legacy. He found his purpose not in spending the money, but in preserving the story, transforming himself from a footnote in a dynasty's end into the guardian of its memory. His worth was no longer in a bank ledger, but in the restored gilt of a ceiling and the knowledge he passed on to visitors. Then there is the story of Alexandra Isles, a former actress and television producer who was once engaged to Klaus von Bülow during his infamous trial. While not an heiress to an industrial fortune, she moved in those rarefied circles. Later in life, after personal and financial shifts, she stepped entirely away from that world. She earned a master's degree in social work and dedicated herself to counseling homeless women and children in New York City shelters. Her days were no longer filled with charity galas, but with the gritty, intimate work of helping people rebuild lives from nothing. The socialite who once graced the pages of tabloids found a deeper connection in the most unlikely of places, trading the performance of philanthropy for its direct, unglamorous practice. Her identity was rebuilt not on what she had, but on what she could give from her own hard-won resilience. Perhaps the most poetic example is that of artists who emerged from the shadow of great wealth. They had been raised with every advantage, exposed to the finest art collections and tutors money could buy. When the money faded, that cultivated sensibility remained, but now it needed a new engine, their own labor. They picked up brushes, chisels, or pens not as a hobby, but as a necessity. The aesthetic judgment honed in private galleries was now applied to their own canvases. The understanding of narrative, once used to navigate society gossip, was channeled into writing. They became working artists, submitting to galleries and publishers, facing rejection and building careers piece by piece. The trust fund had provided the education, but the loss of it provided the hunger, the urgent need to create something that was truly theirs, something that could not be taken away by a bad investment or a trustee's decision. Their art became their new inheritance, one they were actively building every day. These stories share a common thread, a pivot from consumption to contribution. The fall forced a fundamental question: who are you without the money? For these individuals, the answer was not a tragedy, but an opportunity for reinvention. They traded the passive identity of heir for the active identities of historian, social worker, teacher, or artist. The safety net was gone, but so was the ceiling. Their lives were no longer prescripted by a dead ancestor's trust document. They were authored day by day through effort and choice. This resilience did not erase the pain or the shock of loss, but it transmuted it. The loneliness of the gilded cage was replaced by the camaraderie of colleagues. The anxiety of preserving a dying legacy was swapped for the satisfaction of building a living one. They discovered that a life defined by what you do is often far more durable than a life defined by what you have. Their worth became internal, earned, and therefore unassailable. They did not just survive the end of their Gilded Age, they quietly inaugurated a new, more authentic one of their own making. The final legacy of these dynasties is not measured in bank statements, but in stone and story. Scattered across the country, their decaying mansions stand as the most eloquent monuments to their rise and fall. These are not ruins from antiquity, but from a century ago. Their boarded-up windows and sagging porches, a hauntingly recent ghost story. We drive past them without knowing their names. These vast, shuttered homes with overgrown topiaries and peeling paint. Local legends of a crazy old rich person who lived there alone. They are physical proof of a simple economic truth. A fortune large enough to build a palace is rarely large enough to maintain one in perpetuity. Each crumbling cornice and leaking ballroom is a lesson in entropy, a demonstration that without constant, intelligent infusion of energy and capital, even the grandest creation will return to dust. The houses that survived did so by ceasing to be homes. They were donated to become museums, universities, or cultural centers. Their family portraits replaced by placards explaining who once dined in this room. The Breakers in Newport, the Biltmore in Asheville, these are the success stories. Their opulence frozen and sanitized for tourist consumption. Yet even this salvation carries a note of melancholy. Walking through these perfectly preserved rooms, you are not witnessing a living legacy, but a beautifully staged autopsy. You see the wealth, but you feel the absence. The silence in these grand halls is the silence of a life evacuated, a performance ended. The family story is reduced to a footnote on a museum label, their personal tragedies and joys erased by the sheer weight of their own possessions. This transformation from private sanctuary to public institution is the final, ironic twist. The very walls built to ensure privacy and exclusivity now exist to be gawked at by anyone who can afford an admission ticket. The ultimate symbol of status becomes a common commodity. More powerful than any physical ruin, however, is the narrative ruin they left behind. These lives have crystallized into cautionary tales, modern fables repeated in gossip columns, history books, and our very conversation. The phrase trust fund kid is not a neutral description. It is a loaded archetype, implying idleness, entitlement, and an inevitable comeuppance. We tell the story of the poor little rich girl not to remember Barbara Hutton, but to remind ourselves of a moral that money cannot buy happiness. These narratives serve a deep social function. They are our culture's way of wrestling with the anxiety of inequality. They provide a comforting logic to the chaotic distribution of fortune, assuring us that the ultra-wealthy are not just lucky, they are cursed. Their misery becomes a perverse consolation prize for those who struggle. But within these simplified morals lies a set of urgent, practical warnings we would be foolish to ignore. The first is the peril of passive wealth. Money that is received, not earned, operates under a different psychological law. It lacks the connective tissue of effort and reward. It is an abstraction, a number on a page, making it frighteningly easy to disconnect from its real-world value and terrifyingly difficult to defend. The heir is an owner, not a builder, and in a world that respects creation over custodianship, that is a dangerously vulnerable position. This leads directly to the second warning, the catastrophic cost of financial illiteracy. To be given immense resources without the knowledge to steward them is a form of sabotage. It is like being handed the controls to a nuclear reactor after only being taught which button makes the lights brighter. The Gilded Age heirs were deliberately kept ignorant, their education in the arts of consumption, not compound interest. Today, the gap may be less deliberate, but just as wide. How many lottery winners end up bankrupt? How many professional athletes are penniless a few years after retirement? The pattern is identical. A sudden influx of capital meets a complete absence of financial understanding. The result is not just lost money, but lost dignity, lost freedom, and a profound sense of betrayal. The warning is clear. No amount of money is safe in the hands of someone who does not understand how money works. Literacy is not about picking stocks. It is about understanding budgets, debt, taxes, and the simple, slow magic of growth. It is the difference between being a passenger and a pilot on your own financial journey. Finally, these tales expose the absolute fragility of social status, built solely on money. The Gilded Age elite believed they were founding a new American aristocracy. They created intricate social codes, exclusive clubs, and lavish rituals to cement their position. But when the money faded, so did the status. The invitations stopped, the friends disappeared. The name that opened doors became a curiosity or a joke. Their social capital was revealed to be a currency that could only be spent in one very specific marketplace, and that marketplace had declared bankruptcy. This is the ultimate illusion of wealth, the belief that it can purchase a permanent place in the human hierarchy. It cannot. Respect that is bought is loyalty that is rented. A lasting social standing is built on contribution, on character, on what you do for others, not on what you have for yourself. The families we remember with genuine esteem, like the Rockefellers or the Carnegies, are remembered less for their money and more for the libraries, universities, and medical research their money built. Their wealth was translated into something that outlasted it. The others, who spent their fortunes only on themselves and their own spectacle, left behind empty houses and sad stories. Their legacy is a whisper of what was, and a loud, clear warning of what happens when a fortune is treated as an end in itself, rather than a tool, a responsibility, or a chance to build something that does not crumble when the last dollar is gone. The echo of a slamming auction house door fades into a sobering silence. From the ballrooms of Fifth Avenue to the stark reality of financial survival, These sagas are far more than just gossip from a bygone era. They are profound studies in human nature, testing what happens when a person is handed a script for a life they did not write. We watch the same themes replay across generations: the crushing weight of expectation, the vulnerability of inherited wealth, and the quiet, desperate search for an identity separate from a bank balance. These falls from grace are not simple morality tales about the evils of money. They are intricate maps of psychological terrain, showing how the very structures built for protection can become the walls of a prison. The resilience we witness in those who rebuilt is not just admirable, it is instructive, a masterclass in forging a self when the old one has been stripped away. The timeless truth these stories whisper is that money, without the wisdom to wield it, is a dangerous and volatile force. It can buy palaces but not peace, fund escapades but not escape, and secure a legacy on paper while destroying one in spirit. A fortune can be a tool, a weapon, or a burden, and the difference often lies not in the amount, but in the hands that hold it and the heart that guides it. We would love to hear which journey resonated with you the most. Was it the haunting solitude of Huguette Clark, the tragic spectacle of Barbara Hutton, or the shocking transformation of Patty Hearst? Let us know in the comments below, and subscribe to join us for more deep dives into the hidden dramas and fascinating scandals that history has tucked away.